Will you describe Paul Revere's engraving of the event?
Yeah, Paul Revere's engraving, it really copies Henry Pelham's engraving, where you have the soldier, in the background you have the old state house, the seat of the provincial government. Behind that is the first church, and on the other side is the court. So you have these symbols of power, provincial government, ecclesiastical government power, and then the court. And then in the street you have the soldiers standing in a straight line. And behind them is Captain Preston raising his sword. Clearly he's giving the order to fire. Now behind them is the custom house, which Revere labels Butcher's Hall. And out of the window of the custom house you can see a puff of smoke. There are something like 85 witnesses who gave depositions. 5 of them reported they saw a flash from the custom house. The town took that as someone was inside the custom house firing into the crowd as well. Okay, so the soldiers are in the middle of the street, and the crowd is being pressed against the wall on the opposite side of the street. And they're a fairly well-dressed group. They're not sailors, rope workers, dock workers. There's a fairly genteel group. Not one of them is carrying anything. And they're being shot down with real looks of real shock and surprise on their faces. And in the foreground, there's a little dog. It's like someone's out walking his dog, and the troops start firing at them. Art historian looks at this and sees in the way the crowd is arranged an evocation of the Pietà, the agony of Christ. So Henry Pelham actually did the initial sketch. He gave it to Revere, wanting Revere to make it into an engraving, and Revere sure did. And at the bottom he put, printed and published by Paul Revere. So he wants everyone to know it's his work. Henry Pelham said, "You couldn't have robbed me any more certainly if you had held me up on the highway." So it is an inflammatory engraving sold by Paul Revere, printed, hand-colored. It's probably the most important image of the American Revolution.
And it informs our imagination now of the Boston Massacre.
Oh, yes.
Should we change how we view the Boston Massacre?
Well, to what end? I don't know. I mean, we can get at, and actually here's another interesting thing. The town also, or the court also asked Revere to do a sketch of the crime scene so they would know what happened. And we have that sketch where you have the soldiers against the custom house. And you see where the dead are, and they are very close to the soldiers. In the Revere engraving, there's a distance between them, and the crowd has its back to the wall. In the drawing Revere does, it's what actually happened. It's the soldiers with their backs to the wall.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it is something that inflames the public consciousness. And as studying history, we need to be aware of this, and to be aware that maybe what we know is wrong, and that maybe someone is trying to mislead us, which Revere is trying to do, Samuel Adams is trying to do, and even in a way John and Adams and Josiah Quincy are trying to do. That is, they're trying to influence the jury, which doesn't mean what they're saying is wrong. It just means we always have to be aware of why someone is telling us something.
So let's talk about how the Boston Massacre has been commemorated. You mentioned that it was March 5th was recognized for a long time,
yeah,
and then changed to July 4th. How has the commemoration changed over time?
Well, it's kind of died out. Well, one thing that happens, as I said, Boston shifts to July 4th. And every year there's an oration on July 4th. There still is, incidentally, and there's a reading of the Declaration of Independence. In the 1840s, 1850s, Boston has a significant African-American community. It's the first state to abolish slavery. William Cooper Nell, who is an African-American historian in Boston in the 1840s, wrote a book called The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. He's showing that African-Americans have been part of the body politic here. They've been part of the life of the country, even before there was a country. And his book begins with Crispus Attucks at the Boston Massacre. Adams had made Attucks out to be the leader of a mob, but Nell sees Attucks as the first martyr in the American Revolution. And the black community in Boston starts observing March 5th as Crispus Attucks Day, a reminder that we've been here and we have been part of this society. And in 1857, actually on the 6th of March, the Supreme Court of the United States issues the Dred Scott decision, saying that at the time the Constitution was written, black people weren't considered citizens. They wouldn't be a part of the body politic. And in fact, the Chief Justice said, At the time of the Revolution, a black man had no rights which a white man was bound to respect. Well, Nell knows that's wrong, because here you have these British soldiers put on trial for their life for killing this guy on the street. So
and that the town responding in such a supportive way.
That's right. Attucks is buried at town expense. His body is carried out of Faneuil Hall, by the leaders of the town, followed by 10,000 people. So the black community in Boston in 1858 has Crispus Attucks Day at Faneuil Hall, where they commemorate Attucks. They actually bring out a teapot that allegedly had belonged to Attucks. There you see this connection, a teapot, Crispus Attucks. And actually someone else does a lithograph, a different form of technology of the massacre in the 1850s, a guy named Champney. And this one has Crispus Attucks in the center. In the Revere engraving, no one's identifiable by race. We don't know who Attucks was. This engraving, Attucks is in the center and he's holding a club. He's not someone who's waiting for someone to shoot him. He's someone who's taking action, which is what Frederick Douglass and other African Americans are calling on African Americans to do, take action, which is what Attucks is doing. So the black community in Boston really begins an observation of Crispus Attucks in the eve of the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, well, actually the country's much busier commemorating the Civil War than it is the Revolution. But there is still, in the early 1880s, the old State House, which had been the seat of provincial government, and it had been the seat of Massachusetts government until the late 1790s, when a new State House was built. Then it became Boston's town hall. And then when Boston built a new city hall in the 1860s, buildings kind of rented out. And it's a small building in the middle of what Boston is hoping to develop into a big business area. And here you have this old building sitting in the middle of it. Well, why not tear it down? City of Chicago hears that Boston wants to tear down the old State House, and they say, great, we'll buy it from you. We'll ship it here. We'll put it on the banks of Lake Michigan. People will come from all over the country to see this shrine of the Revolution. Now, once Bostonians realize we have something that someone else wants, they say, well, why don't we keep it? But we can't pay for it. So a group of eminent Bostonians get together to form the Bostonian Society to take care of the old State House. These are people with last names like Ames and Frothingham and other eminent Bostonians. And they realized the most significant thing to happen in the building was what happened in front of it. In fact, it's in the Revere engraving. So the leaders of Boston Society get together with the African American community in Boston in the 1880s to commemorate the Boston Massacre, the 5th of March. And they want to not only put a circle of cobblestones in the pavement outside commemorating where Crispus Attucks fell, but a monument on Boston Common. And they do both. There's some opposition. The Mass Historical Society, so other groups of Boston Prominence say, well, wait a minute, why are we commemorating an urban mob? There are urban mobs around now. Are we going to build monuments to the Haymarket rioters and these other characters? But you have the leaders of Boston society saying, no, this is a very important thing. And they do put in the circle of cobblestones. They have a big dinner at Faneuil Hall. And John Boyle O'Reilly, an eminent Irish poet, reads a poem about how an empire rose where Attucks fell. And the circle has a star. The star supposedly represented where Attucks fell. And then there are 13 radii coming out. Oh, wow. So it's 13 states emerging from the death of Crispus Attucks. And then on Boston Common, they put up a monument. The Governor Ames chooses the site for this. And people like, someone from the Mass Historical Society is writing to him saying, you shouldn't have anything to do with this. He's saying, well, this would be a good place for this monument. And it has a bronze of the Revere engraving with actually a gun coming out of the Customs House. And on top you have the names of the victims, Crispus Attucks and so on. And then is Freedom, a woman in a robe, and she is stepping on a crown. And next to her is an eagle. But then on the Revere bronze, maybe as kind of a consolation to those who think we're commemorating an urban mob, you have a quote from Daniel Webster saying, from that night we may trace the severance of the British Empire. And Webster was Mr. Law and Order of the 19th century. Mm-hmm. And a quote from John Adams, who had defended the soldiers. Now, the Bostonian Society has subsequently commemorated March the 5th with a reenactment. And there are reenactors who come and portray the mob and the soldiers. They've also been doing a kids reenactment, but I'm told this year they're not going to do that just because they don't want to have kids getting shot by other kids. So,
Yeah.
but it's a change. We change our perceptions of things, and it becomes sanitized later, and we think about it in different ways.
So why do you think we should now remember the Boston Massacre?
Well, as an it's an essential piece of Boston as a center of the Revolution. Because in Boston, you do have people like John Adams and James Otis who are writing pamphlets and making very good arguments. But you also have people in Boston like Caldwell and Attucks who are part of this whole argument. And really is this mob that then's going to press the soldiers out. The boycott had not been as effective. And this is a precipitating event then, and it sets in motion this challenge to the authority of Parliament. Whether these guys in the mob were thinking about this or not, it does set in motion getting the troops out of town, inflaming the public consciousness to see what is the end if we accept Parliament's power to govern us. The end is having troops here dictating to us. So that's the essential thing about the massacre. Yeah, it's an urban mob, and I'm glad that the guys were acquitted. Years later in London, Adams saw Captain Preston on the street, and Preston didn't recognize him. And Adams was always reflecting on this. In fact, in 1773, he was asked to give the oration on March 5th, and he declined because he said it would be very awkward since he was responsible for getting the soldiers acquitted. However, he said, had the soldiers been convicted, it would have been as foul a stain on us as the burning of the witches in 1692.
Wow.
So it's a signal event. It does give credence to what Samuel Adams and James Otis were saying about the nature of power.